concepts that I think of when I think of behaviorism, and those have to do with conditioning and either reinforcement or punishment. So the first type of conditioning is classical conditioning, and this is something that we've seen in the example with Ivan Pavlov and his dog. He was able to condition his dog to salivate from the sound of a bell alone. So he did that by combining the stimulus of a bell and food to create the association with salivating to the bell. So eventually he was able to elicit the response from the first stimulus alone. So the definition of classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. A response that is at first elicited by the second stimulus is eventually elicited by the first stimulus alone. So the second type of conditioning is operant conditioning, and that is defined as a type of learning where behavior is controlled by consequences, and the key concepts are that there is positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So for the purpose of my metaphor, I'm going to use positive reinforcement and negative punishment to make a metaphor for baking. And we saw the example of operant conditioning in the Skinner box and training the rat to learn that every time that they press the lever, they're going to get food. But using some of the information we learned about operant conditioning, we know that there's positive reinforcement, negative punishment, and positive punishment. So for the purpose of my metaphor, I'm gonna kind of apply it to baking, and there's going to be two groups, and the first group is going to be given a bowl with all of the ingredients, the eggs, the flour, the sugar, the butter, and they're also going to be provided the stimulus of having a recipe. So the positive reinforcement would be adding the pleasant stimulus of a recipe and hoping that it'll increase the outcome of baking a good chocolate chip cookie. So the second group is going to have all the same tools and ingredients as the first group, but they're not going to have a recipe. So this is going to be a metaphor for negative punishment. So they're going to remove the pleasant stimulus, and it will probably decrease the outcome of baking a good chocolate chip cookie. So the reason that I chose this metaphor specifically and those two examples of positive reinforcement and negative punishment is because I thought it was a good example of providing the right ingredients to learn something. So the first group was given all the right ingredients, all the right tools, but it was almost too simple. You know, the outcome was handed to them, and that's kind of a metaphor for teaching and maybe providing too much information that it takes away the learning curve of having to figure something out on your own. So the second group, without a recipe, their behavior of, or quote-unquote behavior of baking not as great of a chocolate chip cookie, it's an example of how students need to struggle in order to really learn. So providing too much information can be harmful because there's no learning curve, there's no situation where you have to fail and pull yourself out. So I know that if the second group were to try this a couple of times and know, oh, next time I should use less eggs or less sugar or bake it for 5 less minutes, then they're going to become more experts on baking a chocolate chip cookie than the group who had just simply been given all the tools and the recipe to succeed in the first place. Baking is a metaphor for teaching and learning because both Group 1 and 2 both were provided resources and instructions in some cases to come to a final product. And like learning, you have to mix all the pieces together and find a way that they all work and kind of metaphorically create the perfect chocolate chip cookie. So if baking is a metaphor for learning, then the role of schools and teachers would be similar to the role of the family and the community, and that would be to provide the metaphorical recipe and ingredients to create the learning outcome. So a family and community can facilitate the learning but not actually make it happen. It has to happen within the student. And the role of assessment has to be similar to, like I said, with the Group 2 that didn't have the recipe. They're going to learn through trial and error and through failing. So if a student is introduced assessment at the right time after all of the knowledge has been obtained through other activities and lessons, then you can kind of predict that they're going to know what they're talking about on an assessment, but definitely not to introduce it too early or too late. And lastly, the impact of social justice and equity would have to do with how this learning translates into the real world and the morals and principles that are taught in schools early on.